All right. Hello, Das. How are you doing today?
Wonderful. Thank you, Paula. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. So thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited about today's little episode. We get to flip the script a little bit on our typical finance and accounting leadership. So often I have conversations. I'm pretty much known as the robot CFO girl because it is my hypothesis that, and it's actually been proven over the last 5 years, that if the CFO is the executive stakeholder in an automation program, from inception, there tend to be better material outcomes and alignment across the board on what should be automated and how to go forward. And you have a unique perspective, an award-winning perspective, in fact, where you were actually given the keys to the automation kingdom from the finance leaders. So I'm really excited about having you today. Would you please introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background, and we'll dive into some of the automation use cases and learnings that you've had along the way.
Well, thank you, Paula, for the generous introduction. Yeah, so I am currently the Chief Data Analytics Officer at Saatchi and Saatchi, an advertising agency renowned globally. Prior to this role, I was actually in Viacom, head of data science and automation, reporting into the CDO, Kern Shearson, who reported to the CFO, Wade Davis, at the time. And we were in the middle of actually a corporate-wide cost reduction exercise, restructuring and transformation services. And as a part of the task ahead, the CFO had been convinced by consulting company at the time, Alex Partners, who came and said that, look, if you have an opportunity to reduce costs in SG&A and other areas, one of the things that you need to do is to look at your opportunities to cut costs in the common finance and accounting processes, such as robotic process automation for procure to pay, order to cash, and records to report. So Wade turned around and asked me to take leadership on this and kind of design a strategy and roll out it with the right technology and consulting partners. So that was how it all started back in the day, 2018.
And I think any COE leader would say that's a dream situation to kind of like come up on the ranks. And the fact that you got to do it at an executive level is probably why you were able to kind of rocket launch, that success and gather so many wins so early on. So before we get to kind of the successful outcomes, I think it's important. And again, a lot of our audience is typically in one of two places, right? They're either what I call RPA rookies, right? Just kind of getting to know the technology, understanding what it's capable of doing, or they're in a position of, okay, we've had a pilot or two, we've had a few quick wins along the way. Perhaps we're trying to figure out how to scale or how to go outside of this business unit and really start connecting the dots enterprise wide. And as you and I both know, where you really start achieving material outcomes is when you're able to find processes, right, that can really deliver value back to the organization. Those tend to be the complicated ones, and you have to kind of build up to get there. So let's start with the journey. As it starts off, right, there's a platform and a partner consideration. So at the very kind of elementary level of what there is to consider, can you give us a little insight into how that process went and how you conducted the RFP and chose what kind of KPIs and levers you wanted to pull, to really measure who was going to help you start this journey?
Absolutely. And as you know, most of these processes have a people challenge first. So I had to first identify a team. So I, asked for a VP person reporting to me who would be more or less PMOing this. And I had a gentleman called James Emerdino who was, critical help for me in kind of PMOing this whole process. And then we identified stakeholders in each of the groups that I just named, procure to pay, order to cash, and records to report, right from the senior vice president level or executive vice president level down to their analysts and planners and execution folks and program managers as a team of about, let's say, 15 people across all three of these areas. And we put together some brainstorming sessions to first identify what are the key opportunities that we know of where repetitive manual processes could be identified for automation. And then we kind of put together a list of things that we would like to see happen and call those features or call those functions. We put some weights to it that we believe strongly that this thing could be automated, which is a 9 out of 10. or this, this thing will have a less opportunity for automation, so let's, put it down towards a 1 or a 2. And then we scored 5 or 6 selected vendors across the board based on their presentations to us on how we would rate them in those areas. And then we multiplied the score with the weight and added up the total. And we got the first 5 or 6 of them through a research that we conducted independently, using Gartner Magic Quadrant to identify that, hey, Blue Prism, Automation Anywhere, UiPath, Pegasystems, there are quite a few players out there that are scoring high. Bring them in, give them the open opportunity to present what they want to do and how, rate them accordingly, and then we landed into 2 of them, which we felt really were close to our needs. And then the next thing we did was we invited both of those teams, UiPath and Blue Prism, to do a POC with us for a week or 2, using our data, telling us how it would be automated and how it would pan out to see, if this is really feasible for us. So what Blue Prism did was they recommended their partner Wonderbots to come and do that for us, and it was really a great opportunity for us to kind of learn as we do. And Bhavyesh Virani from Wonderbots did a phenomenal job of literally sitting down with us for 8 hours for 5 days with his team, taking 1 or 2 key processes and then showing step by step how automation is done, but also teaching us to take ownership of it. This ownership part is critical, because unless people understand how automation works, it will be really a missed opportunity for them to, kind of give way to this whole change as we go through this process. So we decided on going with Wonderbots and Blue Prism, and then we kicked it off.
That's fantastic. No, and I can't speak enough for Bhavyesh as well. It's almost his education background as well kind of comes to play, and he can't help but kind of knowledge share. So much so that most of our programs are sort of built on that idea of kind of co-piloting, because I really think it's a winning strategy. So as you kind of identified the technology, sort of the tools, right, that are going to be used, and you mentioned something very, very important, the idea of the people behind the processes, right? Because when you automate, there's an implication of what the current process is and what the would-be process is. And the way that the human interacts with that new process is going to be very different, if at all. Right? So it could change, dramatically, and there's several scales of how that goes. So once that was identified and you sort of saw these measures, right, to identify what processes were good candidates to be automated, I think one of the things that really helps folks when they're thinking about this is pieces that are going to be automated versus not, but then matching that up against end-to-end processes that are going to deliver material value. So sequencing is very important early on in identifying the areas. Absolutely. Finance and accounting, I think we can all agree on that. You honed in on kind of what we call the usual suspects with record to report, order to cash, procure to pay. But then within that, there's very easy ways to go astray, right? If you don't find the right candidates within those. So talk to us a little bit about how you identified that. Were there implications behind, strong SMEs, right? Like subject matter experts that were helping you that maybe made you want to choose that process first? What were kind of the implications that went into deciding the sequencing of your early development? Because as you know, there's really an important urgency to get wins early on to justify the fixed cost that you pay up front. So talk us through that a little bit.
Great question. So we went in there as operations with our operations hat on. We literally went to the whiteboard using a Lean Six Sigma methodology of define, measure, analyze, improve, and control processes, doing, process flows end to end. And then we were identifying waste so that we actually would, stop some of those processes to be automated, because it's going to be a waste of time. Why are we doing that the human way? And that was when we got the learning that, we literally have to understand how a bot works, which is different from how human beings work. So for example, a person could wake up in the morning and then come to the office and literally open email, download a PDF, take the data, type it on an Excel spreadsheet, and then upload it in SAP, run SAP, generate a report, send an email out to some stakeholders, and do that 100 times a day to spend the 8-hour day. On the other hand, a bot could do all 100 at the same time and process at the same time, look at the synergies between those, prioritize between those processes, and then send an email that will have all the required updates and and POs generated, for example, and then go do something else, be free to do something else. Once we understood the bot way of doing things, it became a lot apparent to us on what processes can a bot independently do versus what processes that a bot will have to wait for human intervention, or what processes had interdependencies so that it's a sequence dependent process. Unless one process finishes, the other process cannot start. We started identifying these, and we developed in Viacom a process called a sniff test, so that with our learning, we would look at new sub-processes and we would run them through that test of interdependencies and sequence dependencies and manual interventions that are required, and then prioritize them according to the simplest paths, and then the gradually complex parts that may require scanning, for example, from Abby, and then reading those fields, and then creating all possible templates of document reading from those invoices to identify the fields using machine learning. So that came much later. So we were able to show, to your point, the initial processes that had minimum dependencies, automate them, go live on them, and then gradually instill confidence in people, and then gradually go into more and more and more complex processes.
Yes, no, and I think that's, they say it's, the crawl, walk, run. I think it's completely true of that. It's kind of like you come up with what I always call the mountaintop, what it looks like, and then you have to reverse engineer both the processes and the way in which your deployment's going to go. And it's so important to sequence that and make sure that you do have kind of, stakeholder alignment, but more the champions within the organization that are actually going to be affected by the new, state of affairs. So I think that's really important. So let's move forward a little bit, because I think there's one thing that the data guys and the the finance guys can all agree on, guys and gals, let's say, and that's that data is king, right? I think one of the things that that we just like, let's just not kid ourselves here. It's about cutting costs. It's about realizing efficiencies. But the really, really smart and modern organizations, it's about uncovering data that can be actioned to make better decisions in the organization, right? For so long, finance leaders and typically those clients, that profile, they tend to look at historical data and model out future ideas based on what the past indicated, right? And no longer is that fast enough, and we're trying to get more predictive and more prescriptive with what we do with our data. And automation is this great equalizer. So one of the tangential benefits of being able to kind of put things into motion from an automated perspective is two things. One, we start to visualize and uncover data that we didn't have access to before. And two, we sort of leave this breadcrumb trail for auditors that's either awesome or uncovering, weaknesses within our organization. So there's kind of two routes that I've seen data go, two of which I think are particular interest to the CFO audience, that we tend to talk to. So let's first talk about, the uncovering story. So, in your role and kind of as you moved forward with uncovering automations, can you tell us a story about some actionable data, maybe from a vendor, or maybe money that was left on the table, or some wow moment that automation was able to uncover in the early days at Viacom?
Well, I looked at it more from a risk management perspective, because we had to have a risk management steering committee where we had HR and finance and all these different team members and IT be a crucial part of what we are leaving on the table and what could potentially be a pipe leak.
So maybe it exposed some data that maybe more than one organization could action, which
correct.
is even bigger.
Yeah, and one could actually end up impacting the other in a way that we would not even know unless we went through an audit process. So we hired Deloitte's automation risk assessment team, and we threw them the challenge quite differently. Usually people, when they have auditors in the building, they say, hey, just protect me from anything wrong, tell us what we need to do. And I just threw back the challenge to them, and I said, I will be firing you if I do not see at least 10 risky things that we have in the implementation. That really freed them up to really be focused and find those opportunities for us. And they went through an entire process of risk assessment and leak assessments, if you will. One part is, of course, the IDs of people who are logging in versus IDs of bots that would need to change every time they log in, and that whole protection process. The other opportunity was that as we were moving from human to bot processes, a documentation of PDD or process design document is super critical. If not, should there be any unforeseen incidents like a failure or something, then we will not know what to do if we need to default into the manual
So
mode.
let's pause
Yes,
there real quick and
right.
define a PDD. For those of us who don't know what a PDD is, that is the documentation that looks kind of like a Visio diagram that's used to help drive what the automation design development is going to look like. All right,
Yes.
carry on.
Yeah,
Just wanted to make sure and interject.
yeah, thank you for explaining that. Yeah, absolutely. It's a critical part of the process as we go along. We were so excited about getting the automations going that we kind of overlooked the idea that someone needs to take the time and rigorously document the new process. And that PDD, if it's not examined by the auditor, a lot of information is left in a black hole. So we went back and started doing that, and it added some time into the process, but it was a good thing that we did, because now we have a foolproof situation that we have left behind, that people can go back and either re-automate or actually look at better ways of doing things or default into a manual mode. So that was one of the things that we learned from having done that audit with experts in the building who look at it from both finance, risk, audit, and technology safety point of view, if you will. And we got a lot of alignment in that process across the stakeholders in the steering committee for risk assessment, including HR. Yeah, which was a big
So
part
you
of
took
this.
a proactive approach is the answer, right?
Yes,
So
correct.
often, my question is the other 70% of organizations, right, that tend to say, okay, this directionally makes sense. They assess enough of a 1, 2, 3 kind of examples of things to automate in year one, let's say, and then they do it, and then as a result of automating, something's exposed. What you did is proactively went to the stakeholders that could potentially be touched by either systems, that connect them, processes, maybe SLAs internally, right, that could affect different stakeholders, and said, okay, what are the risks, in automating that? So I think that's really important to note, and that's the difference of the different hats that wear the RPA lead, right, and the automation lead, is that from a data cleansing perspective, which is just brilliant that we're having this conversation, because you have a data strategy mindset. So to you have to work against something, and the only way you can work against it is to gather that data to begin with. So identifying risks up front is a really great point that I don't think enough people do, up front. So thanks so much for that. So let's talk about this as not a technology and as a human capital strategy, right? You mentioned HR, inviting HR to the table, which I love. I tell my finance friends, your first best friend in the C-suite has to be the HR lead, because ultimately that is the biggest expense in an organization, is human capital, closely followed by real estate, which might change, right, in the future with our new weird world. But it's human capital, right? And really understanding how to budget for talent, and be forward thinking about the kind of talent that you're going to need in the future that might look a little bit different than the bean counters of yesterday and the pivot tablers of today. And so that being said, when you think about the kind of talent that an organization is going to require, and what this is ultimately going to change, how is it that you leverage HR, and how is it that you change the mindset in an organization? How do you influence that forward thinking to say, this isn't a tech implementation, or rather, this isn't just a tech implementation. This is reworking the way that we're going to hire in the future, the type of tasks that humans are going to be kind of elevated to do, and the type of skill sets that we're going to look to kind of supplement this new capability that we've added to the organization. That's a tough change management conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about how you brought those same stakeholders together, and maybe what the readout looked like of that risk assessment with kind of all those stakeholders? I think that would kind of shed some light on some of these things that early adopters have to consider.
Look, risk assessment readouts are always boring and painful, because you're going through line by line by line of assessment results and what could work and what could not work. But the bigger picture that you're asking about, the whole HR and change management thing, is that one must understand that a robotic process automation is could be very emotional to an organization because they know at the very outset that this is going to get rid of a few jobs. What that means is that the middle managers will be worried about their roles. What are they going to be doing in the future? The people who are analysts at the lowest level, who are actually doing a lot of the manual processes, they would be worried about their jobs. And so we had to talk to HR on, first of all, having empathy on that situation. And second, to design a communication strategy so as to, rid of any fear that may exist in the organization that will result in change resistance. So one of the ways that we looked at it is that, there will always be some manual intervention opportunities for people who have the SME context to stay on board. B, for those roles that are being automated, they could relieve a lot of time on their hands to actually do analysis and situational, complex, what if analysis and simulations of what could be done better. They could be better negotiators. That could be better influencers. The human specific qualities that we need to run an organization, they could climb up that ladder and maybe move up and over to other roles that will have that influence while relieving these roles of unnecessary spend, because a bot could do it at least a third, maybe a ninth, sometimes 15th, the time and cost of maintaining overhead in those areas. So once we designed that strategy and we identified some people that we absolutely know would be the SME champions who will stay on board, we took them into confidence and we said, you guys, don't worry about losing your job, but help us get this through so that we can move this team somewhere else and have them repurposed for better solutions. And the second part of the conversation was that we actually did present to the chief HR officer at the time, Fukiko Ogisu, that, hey, look, Fukiko, the future plan for resources from a hiring standpoint will look like an org chart like this. Look at this org chart. We have pictures of Tom and Jones and Sally and Sarah over here. And the fifth one is a bot. So you will be not only presenting a budget next year for how many people you're going to be hiring, you're also going to be presenting a budget on how many bots are you going to be licensing, who will do the job of 3 existing, potential headcounts that you have reduced. That reduces harm from an existing team's perspective of no one's going to be losing their job. It's just that we are going to be hiring a lot less in the next fiscal. That helped the CHRO really design a strategy and go back to the board and say, here is where my new bot/human resources organization is going to look like.
We're going to write an entire blog about that answer you just gave, because that's exactly spot on. Yep. It's like, I wish, that there was more collaboration in that, because that's exactly right. The end goal is not just the automation that you're, the processes that you're automating. It's about what your future state's going to look like and how all of the leaders are going to work together to understand what that looks like. It's not just the CFO and his silo planning out the next acquisition, right? And then the HR person over here kind of learning what RPA is. So just in case somebody asks for it, I know how to hire or interview, right? It's really about kind of cohesively coming together and just let's accept that bots are here. And they are going to play an iterative role in everyone's work life, whether they know it because they're attended or not because they're unattended, right? Is really how that cookie crumbles. So I think that's so brilliant. So, all right, let's talk about one last thing and we'll kind of round it up. The other beautiful, element of your role being digital and data, right? And really approaching it from that lens and that I think is outside the scope of an operations or a finance leader, is being able to recognize and take the technology and look for other opportunities outside of where your command was, right? So finance and accounting, I think check. We can all agree that that's fertile ground for automation typically when you're starting. But you had some really interesting use cases that you uncovered, as a result of just applying that robot thinking to other areas of the business, and then just really getting kind of creative almost on top of, methodical. So there's an art and a science to this. So can you walk us through kind of how you started uncovering those and then how you continued to scale the program by assessing the cost and benefit of sort of these new areas that maybe nobody had thought of?
Absolutely. So as we were learning through the initial implementations, we were actually putting that learning to identify bigger automations using our sniff test methodology expanded to other areas. So there are
Is that
three
patented,
major.
by the way? The sniff test?
Oh, well, the name is well known now in, Viacom, and it was
In the area.
also, we also talked about that in the Blue Prism conference in 2019, and it was taken very well. But we identified some areas like HR, onboarding, offboarding process automation. We identified areas in tax filing automation as a combination of technologies, maybe Blue Prism and Alteryx, for example. We identified opportunities in ad sales processes where there are some low-end processes of RFP fillouts and RFI responses and chatbots working together. We also identified the opportunity to integrate with AI solutions such as voice and then connecting that to a bot. And then finally, the other area was to move outside the four walls of the building and connect with other organizations who are also automating. And that's when the true value in the end-to-end supply chain would be unleashed, when bots from my company will talk to the bots of the supplier's company, and the bots from my company will talk to our customer bots, and then the process gets really to a to a place where it is super fast, it is hyper automated, it is interacting a lot, it is doing redundancies, and then it's looking at also opportunities for reducing some work that previously used to go through multiple silos and get approved, and now does not require that because of the security and audits in place already, and the codification of who gets to see what and do what. And so we were actually looking at all of these areas, and have put out a chart and a milestone based approach to actually automate all of these things as much as we can, relieving humans to do much more humane things, such as, again, negotiating, influencing, policy making, decisioning, doing value judgments, and involving human emotions where needed. But the rest of the routine, mundane, repetitive things to be completely given to automation. So that's how we looked at the opportunities outside our initial finance and accounting areas.
Yeah, and I think that you sort of nailed it. Is ultimately the big picture. We can keep expanding the why, right? It's connecting the dots. I think ultimately it's about automating so that we restore humanity to the workforce. And that we prepare for Gen Z, Gen LMNOP. We've got Gen C coming, right? The COVID kids. And in this hyper digital world, I think it goes without saying that for an organization to continue to exist and remain relevant and competitive, you kind of got to play in this space. And not only that, it's at this time you got to kind of master it, and you should be scaling by now. So thanks so much for your time, Das. It's always wonderful having experts. I really love us, getting together to be able to flip the script on our CFOs. Hopefully they get some good value out of that, and we will see you on your journey. I look forward to hearing what you do in 2021 for your new organization.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much.